you so much. The gratitude to the Center for Historical Studies inviting us, superannuated teachers, to be part of this memorial meeting. And there's very little I can add to what beginning from Romila and down the line to the Landry and Indibird, what all they have added. My memory goes back to 1977 when Ravi Vasudevan, Gopal Mangle, P. Sainath, many luminaries in our batch joined the center. It was post-emergency, and as Indibird rightly said just now, he used the word benign presence. That's the strongest sense I have of him. That we looked up to Romila, Bipin, we were a bit afraid of Gopal, but Kian was the person whom we connected with, and we could go to him for all kinds of issues. We could even complain about, whom we thought were some of the teachers, for what we saw as their, wrongly I suppose then, but as a kind of intellectual arrogance. But Kian was somebody who could always listen. And I remember one day walking home with him, and I asked him, I said, Mr. Panikar, I never called him Kian, and Sir was impossible in JNU and CHS, what did it be, Sir? But, so I said to Mr. Panikar, when do you write? When do you work? Maybe you spend because he was one person who spent a lot of time in the center and meeting. And he said, I get up at 4 in the morning, and I read and write, particularly write, from 4 to 9. That's my time. And that was something which has stuck with me over years. I get up only at 9, but I think like other JNU students, I still have the sense that you need those 5 hours in the day. As me time was trying to read and write. It's just that we do it in the night. About his course, I just wanted to add one small thing. So much has been said about the course on history of ideas. What struck me most as a young student, and I was coming from economics, was that he completely transformed what was, we expected what might be a standard sort of history of the social reform movements of the 19th century into a course in which 2 things stood out. One, Mridul has already mentioned, looking at some of the very well-known figures like Ramohan Roy, completely inverting that image of an Anglophile, a Western modernizer, by taking us through the Persian, Arabic, to Hafatul, Muharrabin, that whole phase. The second, which still stays with me somehow, is how this very sort of high idea, if I can call it, I can't call it high politics, but this idea of the high intellectual sphere of Bengal, the way he just very lightly, completely punctured that idea of the Bengal Renaissance, in the sense of it being this very orthodox affair, and gave to us this, I still remember the quintessential figure that stood out in the whole 6 months that he taught this course, was a very, when I say small, I mean an almost unknown school teacher from Borishal, Ashwini Kumar Dutt. He was, as it were, the hero, Kian's hero of the Swadeshi movement. I also did the course on imperialism on China with him. And later on, when I was researching on the colonial state and nationalism in the last 2 decades of empire in India, I found a lot of the insights I got from that was on the nature of China as a semi-colony, and that whole distinction with India, which was a classic colony in the Irish sense, that came in very useful, and I remember going back to some of the readings on China and going into this. I just wanted to end by just mentioning that when I was in the last, 2 weeks or so that we've been all thinking about Ken since he passed away, what comes across to me very strongly is a person, a scholar who was probably what he did was, and many of you today have pointed to that, he took the first step forward in many areas, whether it was culture or read in history, and moved on. And then others followed in his footsteps to take those areas forward. I'm not going to talk about that in detail here at all, maybe at some point. I think all of us, as Romina always says whenever we meet her as students, that what we do owe it to ourselves and to the center is that we all write down whatever we remember of those days. So that, I think, both about Tien and about the center, this would be a small appeal from this forum here, that is the only way I think that the legacy and the history of those days might remain in these times when, quote unquote, rewriting history or decoloniality is the buzzword. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Sucheta Mahajan. We've seen how over the past 5 decades, scholars, colleagues, those who helped in establishing the Center for Historical Studies, their close association with Professor Panikkar, their deep appreciation of Professor Panikkar has been presented to all of us. And I'm sure you are as moved by what they have to say as I have been. Thank you also very much. Before I request those who are currently teaching in the center, who have also been taught by Professor Panikkar, in fact the last 2 batches that he taught were that of Professor Jyoti Atwal and Professor Burton Gleatis, who will also be speaking. But before I call upon Professor Shangita Dasgupta and the others to speak, may I just check if Professor Venkatachalapati is online? Yeah? Chalapati, are you online? Thank you so very much, Professor Chalapati, for joining us. Professor Chalapati was one of really close, dear students of Professor Panikkar. And of course, we in the CHS, we have been trained to think of those who have studied here and who have passed out of here as very much still being a part of the CHS. So it is in that spirit that I call upon Professor Venkatachalapati to say a few words.
I consider it an honor to pay homage to my teacher, Professor Panikkar. I want to recall that, I didn't study history at all in the real sense until I came to JNU. I came with a BCom degree and a correspondence course in my degree. Professor Panikkar and CHS warmly welcomed me to the center. I learned much from him. He was very, very generous with me. I want to mention one or two instances. of his generosity, open-mindedness, and a completely non-dogmatic nature. For instance, in my PhD thesis, there is only one reference to Professor Panikar, apart from the acknowledgements. I just cited him once in the bibliography. I cannot imagine any teacher permitting his or her student to write a thesis without making frequent references to the supervisor. That is just one instance. And his open-mindedness, I want to give two instances. One was, this was at the height of the Babi Masjid Anjali Bhumi movement. We are familiar with Professor Panikar's stellar role in opposing the communalization of our polity and politics society. So at that time, even in that context, he insisted that I read Dharampal's work. He said, no, leave politics alone, but you have to read beautifully. Though I don't agree with what Dharampal said, I think this is a very important lesson that he, as a teacher, imparted to me to read anything and everything from which one came. Then another instance I want to give is that he was very close to M. Govindan, the outstanding Malayalam intellectual. He was a Royalist. He was close to M. Roy in the 1930s, as early as in the 1930s. Panikar, despite his own political position, had the greatest regard for M. Govindan. He continued to be in conversation with him, despite views which he did not agree with. So that is another instance that I think I learned much from that kind of openness. Then his commitment to what he believed in. Once in the early part of this century, probably this was in 2002 or so, he was already in his late 60s. He was invited to give a public talk in Tiruvannamalai, organized by the Progressive Writers Association. At that time, Professor Panikar was teaching he was the Vice Chancellor at Kaladi. So to arrive at Tiruvannamalai, he had to take a train in the late afternoon at Ernakulam. The train reached Viduppuram at 2 or 2:30 in the night. From there, he had to drive for about 3 hours to Tirunelveli. I cannot imagine many celebrities or stalwarts who would do that. This kind of punishing schedule that he kept, despite his age and despite his health. Whenever he was called for any meeting where he played a role as a public intellectual, he never hesitated. He traveled to Tirunelveli, he traveled to Thoothukudi. I myself have been present in many of these meetings. And one last memory that I want to share is that when I finished my study at CHS and told him that I wanted to go back to Tamil Nadu, he said that that's not a good idea, this is not good for your career. Tamil Nadu is a dead place as far as the historical portion is concerned. I told him it's all the more reason why I should go. If I have learned anything at CHS, it is my duty to pass on what little I have learned to a place which is bereft of good academic, historical academic practice. And even though Professor Panikar did not agree with me at that time, I sincerely hope that he would have changed his mind about that, and if he had actually changed his mind, then I think that is the greatest homage that I could pay to a scholar of a generation where scholarship was about responsibility to society, responsibility towards students, and being a very caring, in fact, to use a very old-fashioned word, he was even an kind of an avuncular teacher. I don't know if it is fashionable to be one such teacher these days, but this is what I remember of Professor K. Panikar, not only as a scholar and a teacher, but as a gentleman who believed that training students and being very supportive and protective of them was a very important duty of a teacher. Once again, I thank CHS, where I learned so much, and I pay my homage to my teacher, K.
Thank you so much, Ravi. I now request Professor Sangeeta Dasgupta, who has been part of this committee of the CHS that had undertaken the organizing of this memorial meeting, to say a few words.
All of you have spoken so eloquently about the center and Professor Panikar, and most of you also taught me when I was a student here, that I only can begin by saying how proud I am that I have been a student of the Center for Historical Studies. And I speak today as a student of Professor Panikar, who joined the Center for Historical Studies in 1988. CHS, of course, when I joined, was a huge name. It was a place of tall intellectuals, the bigwigs of history, who were literally recrafting a discipline, bringing new ways of thinking and writing about history. It was a place where many actually historians from Calcutta University, and I belong to Calcutta, of course, those who had taught me were, in a sense, seeing CHS as a kind of threat, if I can say that. This was a place where history was taught differently, courses were structured differently. There were courses which crossed specializations, where the tutorial system was an integral part of the evaluation process. And I must confess that when I joined the center, I too was full of awe and wondered how to manage here. And as we walked somewhat awkwardly through what has been later referred to as the corridors of power, Professor Panikar was one of those who was again such a tall figure. He was the chairperson, and therefore perhaps for many of us he appeared to be sterner than he was. But what I remember that behind this sternness was a very gentle person, and I echo in diverse words, with a twinkling, with a twinkle in his eyes and a smile hovering around his lips. For the first time, we came to know that an entire course could be structured on just a history of ideas. It was broken down for us, and it was absolutely fascinating. And yet, when Professor Panikar was making such an important intervention and shaping our way of thinking, he never abrasively put forward the points. It was a persuasive way of teaching. It was always very gently delivered. And if we would question what he would say, and we always encourage that, he would very gently tell us, but don't you think? That was the way Professor Panikar would teach us. But I remember most clearly the tutorial discussion. We did not have to write 16 tutorials. We wrote 8, but we struggled with that as well, to be honest. But I remember that when we had the first tutorial discussion at CHS, and we had to write a book review, some of us were apprehensive, some of us were terrified. And yet, Professor Panikar was so gentle as he smiled and told us that his intervention would be minimal. It was we who were to make the presentations, we were to raise the questions, we were to learn how to question and reflect, not just through our own writings, but actually through questioning the others. This was an integral part of our learning process. And Professor Panikar's tutorials continue to structure the way that I conduct the tutorials for my courses. So I begin with the book review. I tell the students that my intervention will be minimal. I expect the students to actually ask questions and it is in a way a legacy of what I have learned, which continues, and we try and emulate the way Professor Panikkar had actually taught us. I will end with my experience as a student of the seminar course which he had offered. So I did a seminar course with Professor Panikkar, and we met regularly. He taught us how to read our sources, engage with secondary literature, and so on. But what I will particularly remember is what he told me as he discussed with me my final grade. I was very happy. But he told me gently and yet very firmly that it was not the final submission that had got me the grade. It was actually the way that the entire seminar discussions were held. What we learned, therefore, is CHS has taught us not just how to write an assessment, how to write a seminar paper. What we learned at CHS was actually how to think, how to reflect on issues, how to question, how to engage with the archive and historiographical debates, and how to creatively think about how we should engage with both the past and the present. I will always be grateful to Professor Panikkar for having taught me all of this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shamita. I now request Jyoti. So Shamita was in the batches at the turn of the 90s, and Jyoti was someone who was taught by Professor Panikkar and others in the late 90s.
I wish to thank Maha, Kankita and Ranjita for organizing this memorial meeting. It's very important, and also for all the faculty who taught us to be here and remembering with us, and also the students who are here. To begin with, as Maha has already mentioned, I joined the center as an MA student in 1997, and so I did my courses. I finished my courses till 99, but I was, I don't know whether I was his favorite or he was my favorite. I think it's both, a little bit of both. And we always develop a liking for a teacher. We understand and absorb what that teacher teaches, and so it was something like that. But in 99, when I think he was on leave when I got into my MPhil, and I was very much looking forward to being his student. But to my disappointment, he had become the vice chancellor. So, of the university. I don't know, not disappointment. And what I remember about him is, in 99 or 2000, pulling his card backwards as he saw me, and told me, rolled down his glass and said, I just wanted to tell you, how are you, and do you know I have become the vice chancellor of the university? And I was like stunned, I froze. I didn't know I was this Panikkar suddenly, and he tells me he's the vice chancellor, and so this is amazing. So that was one of the last things. I've been to his book launches after that, but of course that was a very personal interaction, that was the last one. But on the scholarly front, I think he's given me so much. I built my courses, I built my research, has benefited hugely from his work. And of course, so the first thing which I remember is, which I think needs to be mentioned, is that he taught basically to rethink class and caste in a very different way. That there was 19th century, this long 19th century, which had ideas, as Niels mentioned. The culture was at the center of those ideas, and ideas were not without a class. Ideas were to be carried along with the idea of the understandings of the class that one belonged to and the caste one belonged to. So that was for me learning and unlearning through when I came to CHS. Also, CHS in that sense, 19th century to me was a break with an understanding of the past, of the way we were taught in college, etc. But at the same time, Professor Panikkar had this challenge of addressing Charles Himself in 1960s, who was a considered stalwart, who wrote about 19th century in a huge volume. And I think somewhere down the line, without telling us that he is writing to address the questions, to counter what knowledge had been introduced, he very politely asked us to read him before we read him. So it was very important method which he gave us of first reading what he wanted us to understand, what he was addressing, in a way what he was critiquing. So 19th century opened up as a template, and what I have found over the years, students are sitting here, I always go back to 19th century to ask many questions, to answer many questions that have emerged in the 21st century. And I think that questions of modernity and questions of modernity and method to understand that modernity is what he gave us. And one thing which I would like to mention very quickly is that I thought he was very fearless. That is something, with great poise and ease, he would carry himself and tell you something, and there was a sternness in his voice which didn't make you feel afraid of him. It sort of made you more confident. It's amazing how that happened. And I think that is one ideal teacher that I want to be in CHS. And so I'm very grateful that thank you so much for organizing this. And of course, I carry forward his teaching, and I wrote the condolence note of the center, in which I think that can go around when emailed to everyone. So, I carry forward his legacy, and the center will also carry forward his legacy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jyoti. Professor Jyoti Akbar. I now request Professor Burton Cletus to make his remarks. He was actually in the last batch that was taught by Professor Panikkar.
Yeah, I joined CTS in '98 and because I completed. And I was the last batch I was taught. And when I joined in '98, my BA was from economics, and then I was coming from a village. Then first I continued playing, then it was in and I landed up as a third room in one of my friend's room, and the tutorial system, the classes system was quite heavy. So he told me, like, you can just walk into the front of the room and you can ask him, he will help you. So I didn't walk in, but then I realized over a period of time that every Malayali thought that the Panikkar's room was their second house in and they all were like, not only in CHS, SIS, SIO, study, they had something, every problem they could simply walk in. And I know personally that he had come in very different ways, either academic, otherwise in different job, in so many different ways, they always helped him. Mr. Panikkar was a constant presence in Delhi, in Malayali cultural associations in various ways. So as has been told earlier by he had carried his Malayali identity throughout. His classes were very quiet. We could actually listen like music. He took long pauses, and he always enjoyed his classes. And in his engagement with culture, ideology, and all, I remember the word cultural themes. It was something that stuck. And when I was in Pondicherry, I was doing my postdoc. That's the time that I actually got to go and have dinner with him. And then I realized that his taste was not just culture, but was also food. He thoroughly enjoyed the Kerala food. And everything about the Malayali life. And when you read his book, Against God and the State, it was something, you feel that it is something that he stories about which he grew up. He is from the northern part of Trishur, where the Malabar rebellion was quite badly affected. And that, born in 1926, he probably grew up hearing the stories of the rebellion as a one-sided story about between rebellion that happened between the Muslims and the Hindus. And probably this question led him to ask, was in his mind, it looks like it was in his mind, and he would ask this question that it is not just about religious tension, but it had deep-rooted economic logic to it. And that probably his reflection on communalism and communal history and communal narrative that treats the social tension in terms of purely religious content also comes that communalism cannot be confronted without being a socialist. It was a rebellion from the poor Makulas against landowning Brahmins and the Nayars. He was also telling through his writings that Muslims does not has to be seen in terms of their religious identities, but Muslims and Christians are also positioned within different economic arrangements. And those economic arrangements are more important, more significant than the religious positions which they are located. And it just goes on ideologies that you offered. It was the first time that I came across on indigenous on medicine. And that's the first time that I realized that history is not just about medical history. And that there could be a history of medicine, there could be medical logics, the tension that is played within colonialisms and other kinds of things could also be reflected in the domain of history. And for some reasons I continue to do my PhD on Ayurveda, on medical history, on PS Vayu, on which his article is actually, which we actually taught in the class. So I revisited the same files that we saw. And his course, his approach, his ways influenced me in very different ways. And of course, Kerala history had its own implications like any other regions. And I would say that Kerala history after Professor Panikkar is entirely different. He's working on Indoleka, his writings about Malabar rebellion or about indigenous medicine has hugely influenced and has shaped an entire generation of historical scholarship in Kerala. I fondly remember his classes, everything, and I express my deep condolences. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Burton.